Bava Kamma Daf Peches Amud Aleph, Disrespectfulness b'mi sheyesh lo achva. Firstly, I would like to dedicate the shir, after having had a break, certainly from being here physically in Eretz Yisrael, to the Chayalim who've sacrificed their life al Kiddush Hashem, each one of them for the sake of all of us, both here in Eretz Yisrael and the Jewish people throughout the world. For a refuah shlema for those who've been wounded, and for a return of the shvuim very soon. We know that the mitzvot are divided into ben adam lechavero and ben adam lemakom. There are certain mitzvot that affect our relationship to God, and certain mitzvot that affect our relationship to other people. So, Seder Moed that we learned, Shabbos and Beitzah and Eruvin, those were all ben adam lemakom. Seder Nashim, when we get into the laws of marriage and divorce and so on that we did, that's partially ben adam lemakom and partially ben adam lechavero. And Nizikin, what we're learning now, is ben adam lechavero. These are the laws that govern our relationships with one another. What I want to explore with you today is the requirement that we should act respectfully. Is that ben adam lechavero? Is that an interpersonal law? Or is it what the Baalei Musar call the ben adam la'atzmo? There's a third category. There are some mitzvot which are not ben adam lechavero, and they're not ben adam lemakom, they're ben adam la'atzmo. The way a human being has to conduct him or herself, irrespective of Hashem and irrespective of anybody else. And acting respectfully, is that because you're not allowed to disrespect someone else? Or is it ben adam la'atzmo? It's a way to behave whether or not there's anybody else around. And we'll see it through our Gemara. Let's go through it. So we have in the Mishnah on the previous daf, on daf Pei Zayin Amud Aleph, Hachovel be'eved kanani shel achirim, chayav bekulan. If you damage you injure, you wound a non-Jewish slave, an Eved Knani that belongs to another person, you chayav b'kulam, you have to pay all the 5 different areas of damages that you have to pay to anybody else. Nezek, ripui, shevet, you've got to pay them all. And boshet. Rabbi Yehuda omer, ein la'avadim boshet. Rabbi Yehuda says, one of the 5 you don't have to pay. You don't have to pay boshet because boshet does not apply to slaves. Right, almost a racist thing to be saying, isn't it? Boshet doesn't apply to slaves. Asks our Gemara on Peches, Hachovel be'eved knani shel achirim chayav, my time de Rabbi Yehuda. Where does Rabbi Yehuda get this from? Why should boshet? Boshet is shaming somebody. If you've caused somebody shame and embarrassment, there's a chiv. You have to pay for it. You have to compensate them financially. And we learn in the Gemara how to do that. But an Eved, says Rabbi Yehuda, is not chayav. There's no boshet. Answers the Gemara, Amar Kraki yanatzu anashim yachdav ish ve'achiv. The chiyuv of boshet is learned from the posuk in Parashas Ki Teitzi. 2 men are having an argument, and a woman involves the wife of one of the men, gets involved in a way that is humiliating to one of the men. Then she has to pay boshet. But the words ish ve'achiv, there's an emphasis on a man and his brother. Says Rabbi Yehuda, b'mi sheyesh lo achva, only people who have brothers. If a person is incapable of having brothers or having brotherhood, then boshet doesn't apply, then shaming doesn't apply. Yatsa Eved she'en lo achva. An Eved doesn't have achva, doesn't have brotherhood. Why? Says Rashi, ein lo achva im Yisrael. He can't have brotherhood with a fellow Jew, she'en ba b'kahal, because he doesn't come into the community. And the Pnei Yeshua brings in the name of the Torah Chaim the question, but what about Mamzer? Also doesn't come into the community, and yet he does have achva, he can have brotherhood, and therefore boshet would apply. And the Pnei Yeshua answers it and explains it. There's also another explanation in Rashi. There are 2 explanations in Rashi what it actually means. But the fact is, as the Pnei Yeshua says, there's no way that a slave can have a Jewish brother. Halachically Jewish. He can have somebody who's genetically a brother, but not somebody who's halachically a brother. It's not possible. And therefore, since the concept of achva doesn't apply, the dinim of boshet, of paying for humiliation, learned from this pasuk of ki yanatzu anashim yachdav ish v'achiv, a man and his brother. That's where Rabbi Yehuda learns from that it doesn't apply. The Ra'anana Kollel b'mitzvot. The Rabbanan said that's right. There's no familial connection to a brother halachically for a slave, but there's communal connection. He has the same mitzvot, at least as a woman has. And so the achva, so it's 2 different views of what achva means, what brotherhood means. Does brotherhood mean part of a community governed by the same halachot? Or does brotherhood mean somebody with whom you can have a brotherly relationship, a relationship of a real brother in terms of halacha? So Machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachomim on that matter, both of them agree that without achva there's no boshet. That's not the issue. Both of them agree if there's no potential for brotherhood, there's no boshet. What their argument is, does an Eved have achva or doesn't he? And their argument is based on how do you define achva? Is achva defined familially or communally? That's the Machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachomim. So my question here is the following. When Rabbi Yehuda says, Ein la'avadim boshet, is he saying slaves don't feel shame? Or is he saying there's no obligation to pay for the shame that a slave feels? They're very different. From the wording of the Mishnah, it seems that slaves don't feel shame. Because the Mishnah says, if you look at the words of the Mishnah at the top of the source sheet, chayav bekulan. If the Chachomim say, the man is chayav, if you injured a slave belonging to another Jew, then chayav bekulan. So what should Rabbi Yehuda omer? He should say, patur mi boshet, but not boshet. But he doesn't use those words of chayav and patur, you're obligated or you're free. He uses the words of ein la'avadim boshet, they don't have boshet. So it seems to me on the surface that Rabbi Yehuda is saying that the concept of boshet doesn't apply. And that would be an interesting insight into what boshet is. Boshet is this humiliation. It's a particular form of humiliation. It's different from busha. Busha is shame, and boshet is a particular form of humiliation. And based on this understanding of our Mishnah, we would have to say, in the Gemara here, we would have to say that boshet is the humiliation that a person feels when his pride has been compromised, and pride is sourced in yichus. That's where pride comes from. Today we live in a very individualistic society. A person's proud. Why? Because look what I accomplished. I started with nothing and I became a millionaire. Started from a poor family and I became a famous artist or physician or business, whatever. That's what I'm proud of. But a Jew's pride is, you know who my grandfather was? You know who my Zayda was? You know who my great-grandfather was? You know that I come from Avraham Avinu, from Yitzchak, from Yaakov. You know who I'm descended from? That's Jewish pride. Jewish pride is not my accomplishments. Jewish pride is where I come from. And a person who doesn't have achva, who doesn't have mishpacha, doesn't have family at all and can't have family, that element of boshet doesn't apply. That doesn't mean they're not capable of shame at all. It just means that Jewish boshet, which is what you're paying for, an eved doesn't have. And again, Rabbi Yehuda and Chachomim agree that without achva you don't have the boshet. The only question is an eved, is a slave considered somebody who doesn't have achva? So let's try and resolve whether it's that he doesn't have boshet, as the words seem to imply, or he does have boshet. He can feel shame and humiliation, but we don't have to pay for that. So let's refer to a Gemara in Masechta Nida. Shmuel badak ba'amate. Shmuel did something which in today's environment, if an employer did such a thing to an employee, even a slave, it would be in real trouble. He checked to see whether she had reached maturity. And that means he had to check her breasts. And he did that for whatever reason. He needed to check whether she had reached maturity or not. And then, Dalet Zuzi Demei Boshta, then he gave her 4 zuz for having humiliated her. Shmuel Latame, Shmuel holds, Shmuel Olam Bahem Ta'avodu. The Torah says you must always employ an Eved. You must work an Eved. An Eved needs to be employed, not to have nothing to do. La'avodan netatim v'lo lebusha. All you're allowed to do with an Eved is employ them for work. You're not allowed, if you have pleasure in humiliating somebody, you can't humiliate your slave and say, he's mine, I can do what I want with him. No, you can't. You can use them for work. You can use them for labor, but you can't humiliate them. That's what Shmuel learns from L'avodah netatim v'lo lebusha. So the Gemara seems to be saying in Nido that Shmuel holds like the Rabbanan, that chayiv b'kulan, you've got to pay boshet. Says Tosfot, lehinatzel mi onesh haya noten la. He didn't give her the 4 zuz because he's chayiv boshet. Because we know from the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda amar ba'achove la'avadim boshet, ein la'avadim boshet. So Shmuel, it can't be that because Rabbi Yehuda says slaves don't have boshet. So that's not what it's about. The reason is lihinatzel me onesh, he wants to be saved from being punished for having humiliated her, which is an amazing concept. Even if you want to go like the Chachomim, who do you pay the boshet to? You would pay it to the owner of the slave, not to the slave herself in this case. And so that's clearly not what we're talking about. Why did he give her the money? Says Tosfos, not because he owed her the money because of a chiyuv boshes. He gave her the money lihinatzel me'onesh. So what do we see from Tosfos here? We see clearly the Tosfos holds that according to Rabbi Yehuda, ein la'avadim boshet, you don't have to pay the boshet, but there is a chiyuv boshet, there is an obligation, there is an isur boshet. You're not allowed to be mevayish them, you can't mevayish them. It's interesting, the Tosfos read Paskins, it brings la halacha, and so you see all the poskim bring, ein halacha ka Rabbi Yehuda, ela katana kama de yachid v'rabim halacha ka Rabbi. We don't paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. So why is Tosfos involved with Rabbi Yehuda? Why does Tosfos say, Rabbi Yehuda omer ba'achovel ein la'avadim boshet? V'afilu l'man daman. Even if you want to say the Rabbanan, then it's also a problem. But Tosfos is assuming that Shmuel goes like Rabbi Yehuda. And Tosfos says, clearly the halacha is not like Rabbi Yehuda, the halacha is like the Chachomim. There's a sifro that's important in Parshas Bahar, on the posuk of Lo'olam bahem ta'avodu, ein lecha bahem ela avodah bilvad. The sifra says, you can only use a slave for work. The Ravid says specifically that means you're not allowed to be mevayish a slave. And here's the interesting thing. Who wrote the Sifra? Says Rashi in Sanhedrin, Stam Sifra Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda is the author of the Sifra. So if Rabbi Yehuda says Ein la'avodim boshes, and the Sifra says Lo'olam bahem ta'avodu means, as the Ravid explains, you're not allowed to be mevayish them. Clearly, we see from here that what the Gemara is saying is the slave has no boshet. That means you don't have to pay, but you're not allowed to do it. But we said from the words of the Mishnah, it seems that the slave doesn't experience boshet in terms of the kind of boshet you're paying for. This Jewish pride that we're talking about, the slave doesn't experience. So what do we mean? Why are you not allowed to do that? If you say that a slave doesn't have boshet, then you should be allowed to be mevayesh a slave. You should be allowed to shame the slave because the slave doesn't feel it, so who cares? And yet we see that isn't so. Yet we see that you're not allowed to be mevayesh the slave. We see from the Gemara in Nido, from the Sifra, the way the Ravid explains it, and from Rashi in Sanhedrin saying the Sifra is Rabbi Yehuda. What we see from here is that there are certain actions where the action itself is asur, irrespective of the damage it causes to somebody else. There's an action that is inherently undignified. Dignity is not about what you do to another. Dignity is not ben adam lechavero. Dignity is how you are even if there are no people present. That's what dignity is. So is respect a ben adam lechavero, or is respect a function of dignity? How you behave, whether you can behave in a dignified manner. What is this idea of respect? We see this in the coming week's parasha. You're not allowed to walk up steps to the Mizbeach. There's got to be a ramp because of lo tegaler vatcha alav. And Rashi says, "Va'arei dvarim kal v'chomer uma avanim halalu she'ein bahem dat like pidal bizyonan amrat Torah v'yesh behem tzorech lo tinhag bahem minhag bizayon." These are stones. What's the Mizbeach made of? Stones. And you're not allowed to walk on it in a derech bizayon, in a way that is undignified. Is that because you're going to offend the stones? Says Rashi, Ein bahem dat like pidal bizyon. The stones can't be offended. Stones aren't capable of being offended, but still you're not allowed to walk in a way which, if they were capable of being offended, would be offensive. That's an amazing chiddush in the pasha. How much more so when it is a ben adam l'chavero. So you see here, to walk in an undignified way is not because of the offense you cause to another person. It's because of the lack of dignity within yourself. And so the same applies with boshet. To embarrass somebody, even if they don't feel the embarrassment, you've acted in an undignified way. To humiliate somebody is undignified, whether or not they feel the indignity. You might be talking to a person who just isn't sensitive, he doesn't care, or he doesn't value you, doesn't care what you think of him, whatever the case. You say something humiliating, but the other person is not humiliated. That's similar to the case that we have here. Ein le'eved boshet, says Rabbi Yehuda. Ein la'avadim boshet. And the Sifra holds, written by Rabbi Yehuda, that means the Sifra itself holds ein la'avadim boshet. And yet we hold that lo'olam bahem ta'avodu means, as the Ravid says, she'eino rashai levayisho. You're not allowed to be mevayishim. You're not allowed to humiliate him. He doesn't feel humiliation. It doesn't matter. It's a disrespectful thing to do, whether or not the other person is disrespectful, because respect is a function of dignity, not a function of how the other person feels. It's a ben adam la'atzmo, not a ben adam l'chavero.